say are that I never can stand a blank canvas, so I like getting some blocks of color down quickly. And also that we want to start with the lighter colors first. So I think the lightest colors in play here are really these sort of very pale oranges and very pale creams of these houses or palazzi or whatever they are along the waterfront here. So maybe it's an idea if we begin with those. So first of all, I think I'd like to do this fella here. I think he can sort of anchor our drawing so that we know where we are. So I reckon that to do that, we've got the luxury of having a color made up for us already. And I think that this orange here will do us quite well. So I've got my medium size, it's a number 8 brush that I'm using, although I'm sure a number 6 would work just as well. And I'm just going to paint the outline of that block of color there. I'm going to eyeball roughly where I'd like it on the page. And this is the great thing. The big theme today is that we really don't want to feel that we need to copy. We just want to create something that looks nice and that looks like Venice. We're going to be helped by our photo. We aren't going to be obliged to replicate it. So fairly dilute, pale orange. Where am I going to put it? Well, let's have a look. Let's put it just here. Very light, no pressure. It extends quite a bit of the way, doesn't it? But we've also got to bear in mind that there's sky above it and there's water below it. So it draws the eye, doesn't it? But it's not actually a huge part of the picture, this pale orange house. So I'm going to get that line, and once I'm fairly happy with it, I'm going to just note the angle at which it comes down into the perspective. I always like getting in the outline first. There we go. I think I'm happy with that. Down here, I'm less worried about the bottom because it's going to get painted over with all the hustle and bustle of the quayside, isn't it? So I'm going to just roughly get that down. And then it all comes crashing into these trees and umbrellas. So with those backwards and forward strokes, I'm just going to pull the paint out of the edges and spread it evenly and get a nice pale dry wash just to get that pale orange color of this house. Maybe I might need to reload my brush to complete this wash. That backwards and forwards motion, making sure that we minimize those blooms that look so ugly as we get down this block of color here. Again, not worried about the bottom because it's going to get painted over. So we've got that. And I'm going to wash my brush off, and I think I'm going to do the big house to the left of it now. And for this, we probably are going to have to mix a color because it's paler. It's much paler, isn't it? So I'm going to get my palette. And I reckon that we can use the same orange, but with a little bit of white, just to get it a bit paler. So I'm just going to start by dropping some white into my palette, which I have disgracefully failed to clean. So I'm going to give it a quick swabbing before I begin, just dropping some white in. And now there are these sort of balustrades and things, aren't there? And they are quite a nice bright white. So I might just trace around, leave a bit of blank there where we can put in some white. So I'm going to mix up my color, drop in my white, then drop in a bit of that pale orange. Maybe a bit more white. And once I'm fairly happy with that color, I think I'm just going to start, and I'm going to get the outline, but then I'm not going to fill it in straight away, just because I think we could do with having some white left over to become the parts of those balconies and balustrades and pediments that get hit by the sun. So bearing in mind the angle of the perspective. I'm going to paint some sort of horizontal bands so that we can put in the windows afterwards. Horizontal, and then just some vertical lines just to suggest the gaps where the windows would go. Reloading as I go. You'll see it looks like a window is getting chopped off my building, but I'm remarkably relaxed about that because this picture is pretty wide. It's wider in its aspect than my A4 picture. So I'm all right with the idea that I've just got 1, 2, 3, 4 bays for windows here. And maybe I'll just fill in and create these sort of, get the outline of those arched windows here. Ready to paint those on when this dries later. There's a double one here, so I'll just do a double arch outline. I hope this shows on the webcam. It might look like I'm just miming, but I am painting, I promise. So once I've got just a rough sort of structure there with gaps for the windows, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to return to this pale orange building, perhaps. We're just going to get a feel for how we create windows now that this paint has dried. Actually, you know what? It's not quite dried yet. Let's do another house. Let's do the one next to it. This one to the right, this rather pale one. That's a sort of cream color. So I think we can get that cream color. Let's mix, say, some of our white with some of our yellow ochre. I'm going to do the same thing as I did for our large palazzo over on the left. Drop in some white into my palette, and then drop in some yellow ochre to get that sort of, just a tiny bit of yellow ochre, just to get that creamy sort of off-white. got my white. I'm just going to put in just the tiniest amount of fairly dilute yellow ochre. Just drop some in there and then clean my brush and mix it in. Relatively easy to add more, but pretty darn tricky to take it away again. And I think I'm fairly happy with that for a sort of off-white cream. So I'm going to load my brush up with it. And again, I'm just going to paint this rectangle here. Maybe on reflection, I want a bit more yellow ochre. And then just, again, painting this, following the sort of slanting shape of the roof there. And now, as I've said, this whole picture is a bit wider than our paper, so we can be a bit creative. I think maybe this house would look nice with 4 windows rather than 5. Oh, sorry, 4 windows wide, 4 bays wide rather than 5. So I'm going to paint it in, just bearing that in mind. And then we're going to carry on down the houses. So this orange one here, this pale orange one, this is sort of, it appears to sit over this one here, doesn't it? Because it's taller, so we can see its side. So I'm just going to, again, take a color. Might as well use my pale orange from earlier. And just paint that on. I'm going to bear in mind, though, that there's a little band of white running around that roof. So I'm going to want to leave a little bit of white so that that can be there when we go to paint the dark red roof of the cream house. So I'm just going to start around here with my orange and just giving an allowance for the roof there as it's going to come in. Just get that shape. And then bringing the wall down to meet this pale off-white house. And it's pretty damn narrow, so I'm gonna not paint too far along. And again, pulling the pigment from areas where there's lots of paint just to get a nice even wash. Getting the perspective, the way that it slants slightly in the outline. And then drawing pigment from the dark areas and filling in. Then we've got this red house. And I don't know about you, but things get a little messy at this point. We've got these slightly messy buildings, really squashed by perspective. So I might only do 2 or 3 of those before we then do the Rialto, so that it's in the same sort of place on our plan, on our picture. I like the red one though. That's a nice splash of color. So let's get this red and just, again, do another block of color where that would be. noting where it starts, getting in that perspective, very foreshortened.
Did you use the crimson there?
I think that's the one. It's this one here. Yes.
Okay.
Although, of course, you're all free to use whichever color you think would look the most like the picture or the nicest. That's just what I think would approximate it quite nicely. And then maybe I'm going to do one more pale orange building, again squashed by the perspective. And then I think maybe I'll plan to have my Rialto just here. So I'm just going to get pale orange, middling sort of strength. And maybe I'm just going to drop in another building here. Again, rather squashed by perspective. And now at this point, I think we can introduce our Rialto, this great bridge here over the Grand Canal. And I'm just going to want to start. Again, notice how we've done our first sort of simplification, how all this busy stuff here has been just cleaned up and reduced a bit. We've only got 2 buildings here, but I think we'll still get the same effect of buildings leading into the Rialto on the right. And so I'm just going to get that sort of, again, off-white, creamy color. And we're just going to paint just a block of color here that can be our Rialto that we can then add shadowing to and detailing to later on, just as we plan out our picture. I might mix a little bit more of this yellow, the yellow ochre and white mixture, just to get that sort of slightly creamy stone color. And so I'm just going to paint a block of that color, tilting up, hitting this pediment in the middle, and then coming back onto the other side. And then I'm just going to, again, have it coming down to the waterfront here, arching up in this bridge over, and then down to the other side. And this will serve as our base on which we add our detailing, but it's also, I think, kind of helpful for us, just so that we can bear in mind where all the elements of our picture lie. And so now we've laid down most of the pale colours, most of the large bits of pale colour in our picture. And we've also given ourselves a nice plan of what it's going to look like. We're starting to raise these houses on the Grand Canal. So now I think what we can start to do is to look at putting some windows on them. And as we saw with the Singer Sargent, putting windows on buildings is really easy because a daub of paint in the right place can give the suggestion. I mean, we look at our picture and these windows with their beautiful green shutters, they're just quadrilaterals of green, aren't they? So I think we're going to start off just by painting in some little perspective green rectangles. I might start on my pale orange house and then move left to this one, but it doesn't matter which way we do it. I think we're going to want to paint in the shutters on these two houses, these nice green shutters. And for that, I'm going to use my smaller brush. I'm going to use this size 4 brush. And I think that, again, we've got the luxury of a color in our palette that's all ready for us. I think this one here is a good shutter green. So I think we can use this, mixing up a sort of mid-strength. And then with the tip of our fine brush, starting wherever we'd like, I'm just going to start painting some windows, some shutters rather, onto this house. Don't have to be too exact. I might steal a bit of paint from the slightly darker ones when I start off, just so that they can all be of a roughly even consistency. Steal a bit of paint there. And again, you know, I'm painting these middle windows as they are, a little closer together. Of course, there's no reason why we need to do that. If you think it'd look nicer with them all evenly spaced, then that's of course something that you could very much do. And reloading our brush whenever things are getting a bit too dilute. And I'm going to notice that these windows on the first and second floors, the middle floors, they're a bit taller than the ones on the very top floor. I don't know, but I assume that's because the top floor windows are where the servants lived. Or maybe at any rate, the staterooms, the posh rooms would have been on the first floor and maybe also on the second. Actually, come to think of it, the servants probably wouldn't get a window onto the Grand Canal. Maybe they're just bedrooms. I don't know. And once I've done the shutters on this building here, I've got my shutter green on my brush already, so it'd be rude not to do the building next door, which I think I'll do now. Again, similar, just these sort of rectangles here in the little gaps that I've made for them. I've got that little white outline that I'm going to use just to highlight around the gap that I've left around these shutters. That I'm going to use to highlight the light parts of the frames and things around these windows. You can also see in the course of my simplifying that this building to the left has lost a story. And again, I think as long as it looks like a building on a Grand Canal, I am fairly unconcerned. So I'm just going to do these open shutters on the top here. And then finally, once I've finished with these, I think I might just do the shutters, which are in a similar shade of green, just on our tall orange house over here. There are some green awnings as well, so I might just paint those on, just like that. I'll just wait a moment just so that we're all happy that we've got our windows in, our shutters even. And then we're going to do our first sort of sleight of hand, like Singer Sargent did, just to suggest the shadows on these pediments above the window frames, because we can see here that we've got these frames and that there's shadows where there are these ledges above the windows, but all that would be very complicated to try and elaborately suggest. So we're just going to use a couple of strokes of dark paint just to suggest that and bring those windows into 3 dimensions. Are we all ready to do that, or would we like a minute or so more on the shutters?
Minute, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine, absolutely. Are we about ready to move on?
Yeah.
Yes.
Lovely. So what I'm going to do now is quite small. So for the purposes of this webcam, I've done a Blue Peter and I've done one earlier. I'm going to show you what we're going to try to do on our windows. And it's this sort of effect. Let's see if it'll focus in. We're going to just paint some carefully done little wedges of yellow ochre just to get just to imitate the shadowing of the window frames over our shutters there. So you can see I've got a sort of a right angle there, a dark shadow, fairly thick shadow going along all the top of the shutter, and then running part way down, sort of fading into the side. And then above it, with a very tiny gap in between, I've got another line just to suggest the sort of layout of that pediment on top there. Could everyone see that?
Yes.
Lovely. So I'm just going to get my small brush, my number 4, and rinse it off. I'm going to load it with fairly thick yellow ochre. And then on my pale orange house, this one here, I'm just going to add in those sorts of shadows of pediments there. I'll start off, I think, with the larger ones. I'm just painting in this thin, well, this fairly thick. It expands outwards. It's sort of, there we go. It's longer towards the top than on the bottom where it's next to the shutter. And then just painting it halfway down. Then a very thin extra line just on top like that. Just suggest a little sort of window frame like so. And I'm going to do that for my other windows. And so while I've got this color on my brush, this yellow ochre, I think we can do some more shadowing to suggest sort of elaborate window moldings on these windows here. So for example, we can see the shadowing in these sort of recessed arches here. I think we can suggest that by painting some sort of swooped semicircles of ochre, and then maybe we can use a second darker color to get the inner bit once that's dried. We can also maybe use some fairly dilute ochre to suggest the screens that lie behind the shutters, the windows with their shutters open. So that's, I think, what I'm just going to do now. And now we're going to have a look at the windows of our house to the right, this one here, which looks like a sort of phantom on my paper because it hasn't come out too clearly, but we're going to add some more color on. And we're just going to have a look again at these, and do tell me if I'm being incredibly colorblind here, because I'm aware that my photograph doesn't have any black in it. But again, we can see a similar sort of thing going on here. Maybe these windows look darker. Maybe they don't have shutters. Maybe they're just a very dark gray that we can use for the windows themselves. But for the shadowing itself, that looks almost dark red to me. I don't know if it does on your pictures as well. Does it look that color? I'm asking because
I see grey. I think I see grey.
Yeah,
okay.
shades of grey, really.
Okay, so thank you for letting me know, because my picture will look slightly different because I've not got any black ink in it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to paint that sort of shadow color there. We can see again it's a sort of kick-shaped little bit of light sort of shadow along that's cast by the pediment, and then we've got the darker color of the window itself. So what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to start off by just getting that light color down, and I'm afraid I'm going to use my sort of burnt sienna because that's what it looks like on my picture. But please do use what color you think that shadow above the windows has on your picture. And I'm just going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to load my brush up with, again, fairly thick to get a fairly controlled wet on dry approach. Fairly thick sienna. And then I'm just going to, I said earlier, didn't I? I think this house might look nicer with 4 windows than 5. And of course, we have that power to change the layout of our buildings here. So I'm just going to paint some little swooshes like that. You can see just a line along and then a sort of a swoosh backwards. just to get a little bit of shadow there. And those are going to form the tops of the windows here. Maybe some slightly more pronounced swooshes for the bigger first floor windows here. So a similar thing. A line along, and then just backtracking diagonally down a little bit, just to get that sort of shading back. Maybe I'll add a little bit more emphasis to these bigger ones here. And now I've got my burnt Sierra color. I think that color would probably work quite well for the roofs of our houses, which I think I'd like to do now. We've got the roofs of this house here and this house here. And so I'm just going to, again, using my fine brush loaded with fairly thick burnt sienna, I'm just going to paint that on. And I'm going to notice that white sort of edge there. And so I think I'm going to start by just painting just this bit here, the band of roof that runs along underneath that white band, and it sort of hips back a little like that, doesn't it? I'm going to get that down. And then I'm going to paint a little bit of roof that goes above, outline that sort of white band, which I think looks quite nice. And maybe I'll refine it a bit when I go over again. Maybe this roof is going to be a bit bigger and a bit more pronounced than it is in the picture. But I'm very happy with that. I'm going to trace in the gap that I've left.
Is that the red you're using, Felix?
It is burnt, I think it's called burnt sienna, it's this one.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah.
That's all right. Although, of course, if you'd like to use red, that is up to you. It's just a color that I think will look nice for a roof here.
That's good.
You're getting lots of shots of my face today. I do apologize. It's all this work with the fine brush. I end up getting very close to the picture. And then I think I'm going to do a similar thing for the roof of this taller orange house here. Just following the shape of the roof as I see it on the picture. You can also see that I've carelessly made a little splotch. Happily, it's too small for you maybe to see it properly, but it's just here, so I'm just going to take that out. And then again with fairly thick, fairly concentrated burnt sienna, just going to paint on the roof of our orange house. And again, I say that we don't have to pay too much attention to the picture, and that's true for intricacies and details of what goes, of how many windows a building has, or the order of things. But when it comes to perspective, the picture is very, very helpful. So I'm going to follow the perspective of the roof as it's given here. I can get that feel now of a building. I do think it's slightly magical how we start off with these blobs of colour, and as more blobs of colour come to join them, at some point they just tip into looking like something recognisable. And these are now, I think, starting to look like houses, like houses with slightly Venetian tall windows and hipped red roofs. And I'm going to have a look at my picture, and I'm going to get sort of creative again, and I see this red house, and it has sort of green shutters in the picture, but I might try some very thin burnt sienna windows there and just see what that looks like. Just again, like we saw with Singer Sargent, just some almost just suggestions of windows. Just a thin line on the left-hand side, and there we've got a sort of curling round to suggest a sort of window shape. And then maybe I'll do some similar sort of approximations of windows in my dark shutter green on this final yellow building just next to the Rialto. Now I think I just want to add a few more rooftops, because of course once we've got our rooftops in, then if we like we can add our sky, we can focus on the lower half, just to get those in. And so what I'm going to look to now is another thing where we're going to do a slight sort of trick with shadows, because shadows are very much our friend here. Shadows allow us to suggest elaborate sculpted forms and things very quickly. So we're going to have a look here at these. What are these? Are these corbels on these sort of, is it a cornice? These cornices on the tops of these houses here. And I think again, if we look at that from quite far away, we can suggest that quite easily by using a very dark color and just painting at intervals. Because if we look, we can see that the light is coming from, from the sun, and it's hitting them at a certain angle. So it hits part of each of these individual bits of carved stone, but the rest gets left in shadow. And so if we paint something to approximate that, I think we can get something that looks very good indeed. So the color, I think, of these moldings is white. They're in this sort of white stone that fleshes out these little fripperies here. So shadow on white is going to look gray. So I think I'm going to want to mix myself up some, maybe a mixture of battleship gray and white. And I'm going to use a mid-sized brush to do that, just because it's quicker to get the paint into the palette. But I'm going to be working again with my tiny brush, just to get that detailing onto the tops of these houses. So I'll start by loading in white. Maybe not too much because it's quite dark shadow, isn't it? Even I can tell that with my weirdly misprinted picture, so I'm sure it's quite a dark color. I'm just going to muddle together some battleship grey and white now. And then once I've got that sort of dark grey loaded into my palette, I'm going to take up my small brush. I'm going to have a real look at what exactly these bits of sculpted masonry look like. And we're going to do that trick where we forget that we're painting a house and we just try to paint the blocks of color in the shape that we see them. And as soon as we do that, we can replicate it quite well. That's what I think is one of the reasons why we always struggle to paint and draw faces, is that we've got such a set idea in our brain of what a face looks like that we don't actually see the wood for the trees. We don't just draw the light that's there in front of us. So that's what we're going to want to do here. We're just going to want to draw the shadows as they appear onto our building. I'm going to do a thick, dark band of shadow first, sort of running along the top. And then I'm just going to create these little flicked wedges of shadow now, just to get those little sort of shapes in that suggest the light hitting that masonry. Just get those sort of lozenges of light in. And we can do a similar sort of thing on the building immediately to its left. I'm going to start off with a nice band of shadow. And then just put some shapes in between. And because this is a bit closer, the gaps between the bits with light are a little bit wider. So I'm just going to pay attention to that, because that's another thing about perspective that this picture can help us with. So I'm just going to paint the gaps between a little light reflected off those individual bits of masonry. And as with all things, it's a fairly imprecise science, but when it comes together with the other elements, I think it'll look very nice. And then after a little gap to account for little lines of light where the sun hits those bits of sort of fluting and indents in the stone, I'm going to paint a very thin line of thick, dark grey, thick grey from my palette, just to get that out. So I'm going to have the top here, then a thin line of white space, and then another line of grey.
Got a light grey going in at the moment, Felix.
Yes.
Sorry, I've just missed something there. Sorry.
So what I've done, Carol, is I've mixed my Battleship Grey with white in my palette.
Yeah.
And have you got Battleship Grey too? It's the dark grey immediately above black.
It's very difficult to tell because this is quite a different palette completely, I think. I've got black and that's it.
Okay, well, not to worry, because again, you know,
I'm doing the best I can. Obviously.
yes, well, that's fantastic, and I think if you just mix white with a tiny little bit of black until you get a grey that you're happy with, I'm sure that will be fine.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah.
Lovely. I'm sorry that you have to struggle with these different colours, Carol, but it sounds like you're managing very well.
It's just adapt and change, isn't it? It's one of those things. It's okay.
Yes, good. Okay. And now that I've got some of that down again, you know that I always like to get things on the page to ensure that we have some sort of a sense of where we're working from. So I think now we want to have a little look at the key side here. And I think number one on my list are these bright umbrellas. I think these are a fantastic splash of color that really draws the eye, doesn't it? The red here, here, and here really grabs your attention. And so I'm going to put up some umbrellas, I think, and I'm going to use this bright red here to do that. And I think I can use my small brush again, my number 4 size. And again, we can always restate and redraw the bottoms of our buildings, but these umbrellas sort of come along at the bottom, don't they? So I'm going to load my brush up, having washed it, rinsed it, loaded with a little bit of water, tapped out the excess, with a fairly strong, fairly thick, bright red. And I'm just going to paint in some shapes there to get these umbrellas. Maybe I'll leave a little gap for for that lamp post or something. That lamp post can have a bit of a gap. Just a very rough outline. You can see I'm not trying to paint individual umbrellas. I'm just trying to get the outline of a sort of great swatch of colour. A great slash of umbrellas that's coming across this bottom house. And then just peeking into this one as well a little bit. And once I've got the outline, I'm just going to fill that in. A fairly dry wash. Get that nice strident red. We can do some shading to make these look a little bit more like three-dimensional umbrellas. We can see they're a little bit darker on the sides that hang down. But for now, I'm just getting that baseline, that base coat of red in. And maybe I'll also paint in these trees that we can see just above our umbrellas. So I'm going to start, as ever, start with the lighter colour. Small brush in hand. Leaf green, I think. We're going to do the whole outline of the tree in leaf green so that we can then add shadow on top of it to create a bit of depth later on. So again, loading up with fairly thick leaf green. And then just going to town and just getting this sort of, these flicks of our brush just to suggest the ends of leaves there. Getting the rough shape of these trees in. Again, wonderfully imprecise because we're going to add some more colouring onto these. Just flicking them out a bit. And I always moan about how nasty blooms are and how we want to get rid of them, but actually some of them can kind of help to add some sort of mottled shade here. So if there's a bit of inconsistency there, I'm not going to be too worried about it. Now, folks, yet again, time has run away from us and it's nearly 1:15. So we'll just finish our trees. Now, I know that often when we do these these paintings, we end up with a work in progress by the end of it. We don't quite have time to finish everything. And that's because I think what's important is making sure that we learn the techniques and get a sense of how the techniques work and have a confidence in using them. But this is quite a big picture, and there are a couple of other techniques that I'd like us to explore, like how we get the water. We saw Singer Sargent using these very loose brush strokes, these wet on wet to get water and things. So I was wondering, I've got another picture lined up, but how would we feel about continuing this Venice landscape next week?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's a
Fantastic.
good idea.
Absolutely. Well, how did we find this? Because Teresa told me she'd had a few people saying they were a bit spooked by this, but has this shown you that actually we can do things and we can break it into manageable chunks and we can get a nice picture out of it?
Absolutely. Yes.
Fantastic. I'm very happy to hear that. Well,
Perspective is always a bit of a problem, though.
it is, isn't it? I think that's the one area where we do need to, that's where the picture really helps us, I think. And that's where I think that's just something that improves with practice. I'm afraid I can't let you all go without seeing your masterpieces in progress. So if you could hold them up, please. How fantastic. Those are lovely. Thank you very much. So next week we will be finishing off maybe some buildings on the other side. We'll be filling in our Rialto, some sea and sky, and then we'll have our Grand Canal landscape. Until then, folks, have a very lovely week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Felix. Bye-bye.
Thank you.